He was not born into power. He was not born into wealth. He was not even born into freedom. He was sold. Somewhere on the vast steppes of Central Asia, in the early 1200s, a young boy from the Kipchak tribe was torn from everything he knew and placed in chains. His name was Baybars. He was roughly 11 or 12 years old, and the world had already decided what he was worth: a price tag, nothing more. The slave trade that ran through the medieval Islamic world was vast and ruthless. Boys from the steppes, from the Caucasus, from the edges of the known world were captured, bought and sold like livestock. Most of them disappeared into obscurity, nameless servants in nameless households, their stories ending before they even began. Baybars was different, not because fate was kind to him, but because he refused to let it not be. He was purchased by a Syrian merchant, then resold again, each transaction stripping away another layer of whatever life he had known. But somewhere in that chain of humiliation, something remarkable happened. Someone noticed him, not his pain, not his loss, his eyes, sharp, calculating, burning with something that had no business being in a slave's face. He ended up in Egypt, in the hands of the Mamluk system, a military institution unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen. The Mamluks were slave soldiers, boys purchased specifically to be trained as warriors, stripped of tribal loyalties, family connections, everything that might divide them, and forged into something singular, lethal, loyal only to the Sultan and to each other. For most boys, this was simply a new form of captivity. For Baybars, it was an opportunity. He trained with a ferocity that made the other recruits uncomfortable. He was faster, harder, more focused. While others rested, he practiced. While others complained, he observed. He watched how power moved through the Mamluk hierarchy, who gave orders, who received them, and most importantly, who was feared. He was going to be feared. He had no idea yet just how much of the world would one day tremble at his name, but the foundation was being laid, one brutal training session at a time. The slave was becoming something else entirely, and the world had no idea what was coming. 1250 AD, the Seventh Crusade, and the most powerful Christian army in the world was marching into Egypt. King Louis IX of France, St. Louis, had assembled a force that was supposed to be unstoppable: heavily armored knights, elite infantry, the full weight of European crusading ambition behind him. His target was Cairo. His goal was to break the Islamic world once and for all. He was so confident of victory that he had already planned the victory celebrations. He had not planned for Baybars. At the Battle of Al Mansurah, the Crusader forces pushed deep into Egyptian territory, moving faster than they should have, more reckless than was wise. The vanguard, led by the king's own brother, Robert of Artois, charged ahead of the main force and stormed into the city of Al Mansurah itself. It was a trap, and Baybars had positioned his men inside the narrow streets of the city, deliberately. The moment the Crusaders entered, the Mamluks closed behind them. In the tight alleyways, the heavy European cavalry, so devastating in open battle, became useless. They couldn't maneuver, they couldn't charge. They were surrounded, dismounted, and slaughtered almost to the last man. Robert of Artois died in those streets. Thousands of Crusaders died with him. Baybars hadn't just won a battle, he had outsmarted the best military minds of medieval Europe on their own campaign. But this was only the beginning, because while the Crusaders were a threat from the west, something far more terrifying was approaching from the east, something that had already burned Baghdad to ash, something that had shattered every army it had ever faced. The Mongols were coming, Genghis Khan's descendants had carved a path of total destruction across Asia and the Middle East. Empires that had stood for centuries collapsed in weeks. Cities that had existed for 1,000 years were reduced to rubble. The Mongols did not negotiate. They did not show mercy. They simply destroyed, and now they were turning their eyes toward Egypt. Every rational calculation said Egypt would fall. Every precedent said resistance was pointless. Every empire that had tried to stop the Mongols had been obliterated. Baybars did not care about precedent. 1260 AD, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous empire in human history. It had never lost a major battle in open field. It had consumed Persia, Iraq, Syria. The Caliph of Baghdad, the spiritual leader of the Islamic world, had been executed, wrapped in a carpet and trampled by horses, so the Mongols wouldn't shed royal blood directly. The message was clear. No one was safe. No title, no army, no wall could stop what was coming. The Mamluk Sultan at the time sent envoys to the Mongol commander Hulagu Khan. They were executed. The Mongols sent their own envoys to Cairo, demanding surrender. Baybars had them killed. There would be no negotiation. At the Battle of Ain Jalut, the Eye of Goliath, in September 1260, the Mamluks met the Mongols in open battle in the plains of Palestine. No running, no hiding behind walls. A direct confrontation with the army that had never been beaten. Baybars commanded the Mamluk vanguard. His tactics were extraordinary. He used a feigned retreat, pulling the Mongol forces forward into a trap, drawing them deeper and deeper until the main Mamluk army closed around them from the flanks. The Mongols, accustomed to breaking enemy formations with sheer momentum, found themselves suddenly surrounded. Their own tactics turned against them. For the first time in living memory, the Mongols broke. They retreated, then they routed. The Mamluks pursued them relentlessly, destroying the Mongol force piece by piece. Ain Jalut was not just a battle, it was a wall, the furthest point the Mongol tide would ever reach into Africa and the Middle East. They would never recover that ground. The world had watched empire after empire crumble before the Mongols. Baybars had looked at that same force and found its weakness. But power in the medieval Islamic world was never safe, not even for heroes, because the Sultan who had led the Mamluks to Ain Jalut, Qutuz, was celebrating the greatest victory of his generation, and Baybars rode up beside him and killed him on the road back to Cairo. In a moment of calculated and utterly cold-blooded ambition, Baybars assassinated the Sultan and seized power for himself. The slave who had been sold for a price tag had just become the most powerful man in the Islamic world. Power taken by the sword must be held by the sword. Baybars knew this better than anyone. He had not survived a life of slavery, a Crusader invasion, and the Mongol apocalypse by being naive about how the world worked. As Sultan of Egypt and Syria, he moved with a speed and decisiveness that left his enemies permanently off balance. He reorganized the Mamluk military into the most effective fighting force in the region. He built a postal system, the Barid, that allowed him to communicate across his empire faster than any rival could respond. He personally led military campaigns almost every single year of his reign. The Crusader states that remained in the Holy Land found themselves facing an entirely different kind of opponent. Baybars didn't just fight battles, he dismantled Crusader power systematically. Fortress by fortress, city by city. Caesarea, Arsuf, Jaffa, Antioch, one of the great Crusader strongholds, a city that had resisted sieges for generations, fell to Baybars in just 4 days. He was also something the Crusaders had not expected, a ruler who understood the politics of legitimacy. He brought a surviving member of the Abbasid Caliphate to Cairo and had him recognized as Caliph, giving the Mamluk Sultanate a religious authority that cemented his power across the Islamic world. The Mongols attempted to return multiple times. Baybars defeated them again and again. The tide that had swept away everything in its path could not sweep away him. He ruled for 17 years. He died in 1277, reportedly from drinking a cup of poisoned kumis that had been intended for someone else. History has a dark sense of irony. A boy sold into slavery, a soldier forged in a military institution designed to strip him of identity, a general who defeated the Crusaders and stopped the Mongols, a sultan who rebuilt an empire from the ruins of everything that had come before. Baybars never forgot where he came from, because where he came from is exactly what made him impossible to break. And that is the kind of story that history never forgets.